Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take your sources, sometimes quite a stack of them, and pull out the most important, surprising, and yeah, sometimes even humorous bits of knowledge.
hmm
Today, we're zooming in on a nation that one source called a barely visible speck on the globe and almost invisible on the radio waves,
Wow, that's quite a description.
isn't it? But behind that speck lies this incredibly rich, complex history, a vibrant culture. We're talking about Lesotho, often known as the Kingdom of the Sky.
And our goal today, our mission, is really to guide you through Lesotho's unique story. We'll be looking at everything from, ancient rock paintings right up to its modern economic struggles.
Right.
We want you to come away from this feeling like you really get Lesotho, that you've maybe learned some surprising things, and see how it all fits together.
Okay, so Kingdom of the Sky, love the name, it immediately grabs you. But let's ground ourselves. What are the absolute first things we need to understand about its geography, its people, to kind of set the scene for this deep dive?
Well, that name really does nail it. It's entirely landlocked, a mountainous little kingdom, completely wrapped by South Africa.
Completely surrounded.
Completely.
Yeah.
And the main ethnic group, the Basotho, are known as Highlanders by tribal name, temperament, and occupation, which fits perfectly.
Highlanders, okay.
Yeah. Economically, like diamonds, water. They actually sell water to South Africa. It's a major export,
Wow, okay.
agriculture, obviously, and also money sent home, remittances from Basotho working outside the country, mostly in South Africa.
Got it.
But underneath all that, you've got this constant tension, this sort of push and pull between very deep traditions and, well, the pressures of the modern world.
That tension feels like a running theme, doesn't it? And it's facing some really big modern challenges, too. I mean, the sources point out it has one of the world's highest HIV infection rates, which is just
It's
slang.
incredibly stark.
Yeah. So let's unpack this story. Let's go right back to the beginning. Ancient roots. Our sources talk about archaeological, find in Middle Stone Age tools, cave paintings. We're talking human presence going back thousands of years.
hmm And those cave paintings, they date back to around 3000 BC. Apparently, they have this very distinctive red color, and the animals are drawn incredibly realistically.
Yeah, lifelike detail, the sources say.
Exactly. And the thinking is that the Sand people, the earliest inhabitants of southern Africa, were likely the artists.
Okay.
And the Basotho people, who are dominant today, are thought to be descendants of the An, but also mixed with Nguni ancestors who arrived later, maybe 700 years ago or so.
Okay, so you've got this long history, different groups. Sounds like it might have been quite fragmented. How did they ever come together? How did a sense of like a Basotho nation even emerge? Was there one person or a key moment?
That leads us right to a really central figure, Moshushu I,
Yeah.
often called the father of the nation.
Right.
And the sources don't hold back, calling him the most brilliant African leader of his time. Quite the statement.
Wow. What made him so brilliant?
It seems to have been this rare mix of qualities: wisdom, charisma, apparently great compassion, but also real political smarts, bravery, and just astuteness. He knew how to navigate things.
So he's the architect figure. How did he actually pull people together? It sounds like it was a pretty messy time.
He did it very skillfully. He united lots of different separate Sotho clans into one single political unit, a polity. And this was during the 1820s, an incredibly turbulent period.
Turbulent how?
Well, you had these wars of expansion happening, which brought the Basotho into direct conflict with white settlers, British settlers, moving up from the Cape Colony.
Ah, the clash of worlds.
Exactly. And these conflicts, this friction, ultimately led to the Sotho kingdom coming under colonial rule, under British protection, by the end of the 19th century.
It's interesting, though, the sources mention that colonization, for all its downsides, also brought what's called a brilliant education system. It produced some notable figures like Chief Josiah Rabali, Dr. Ninko. How brilliant was it really, though, from the Basotho perspective, I mean? Was it a clear plus or more complicated?
That's a really good question. Because brilliant is, well, it's complicated, right? It wasn't just a simple positive.
Okay.
It's more like a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
The insight here is that these colonial policies, even ones that look beneficial like education, could simultaneously empower some Basotho, give rise to new leaders,
Right.
but also at the same time kind of fracture traditional ways, traditional structures, by bringing in totally new ideas and values. It left a really complex legacy.
A legacy that definitely carried into that next phase, the British protectorate. So in 1868, it shifts from being a crown colony to a protectorate. What did that mean on the ground?
Well, the initial hope for the Basotho was, security,
Mhm.
protection against South Africa basically wanting to swallow them up.
Yeah.
It started with this kind of dual administration, civil and military. But later on, the British started seeing it as an expensive liability and kind of wanted to offload it.
But it wasn't exactly peaceful during that time either.
Not at all. The sources describe it as an era marked by Lesotho border wars, diminishing of Basotho prosperity and increasing of Boer aggression. So, still lots of conflict.
Sounds relentless. So how did all this, the British protection, the constant pressure from South Africa, how did that shape what it meant to be Basotho, their identity?
This period was absolutely critical for identity formation. It was defined by this intense struggle between tradition and modernity, especially in the late 19th, early 20th century.
How so?
You had massive, rapid social and political changes being driven by the British authorities. Plus, you had this huge movement of people, miners, going to the Kimberley diamond fields.
The diamond rush.
Exactly. And this created this split, this divergence between what the sources call passive Basotho, maybe those holding on to tradition, and the progressive settler communities.
And the outcome sounds pretty rough. Race riots, poorly educated youth, and the collapse of both traditional institutions and the work-based morality of the Basotho. That's heavy.
It really was a period of profound disruption. And then you throw the Boer Wars into the mix, the fights between the British and the Dutch settlers starting around 1899.
Right. How did that affect Lesotho?
Well, the Sesotho people were caught in the middle, weren't they? They felt oppressed by the Boers. But they were also, understandably, growing pretty distrustful of the British, too.
Yeah, stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Literally, in some ways. There are these vivid accounts of mountain artillery just shelling towns like Maseru and Marija, villages being burned down, just awful stuff.
God, you can just picture the devastation. And even when the Treaty of Vereeniging brought peace in 1902, the sources say it left Lesotho's defensibility coveted by the Cape Colonies alone. So the threat didn't really go away.
No, that vulnerability is key. It really sets the scene for the next chapter, the push towards self-rule.
Okay, so moving into the 20th century, the interwar years, things didn't improve much internally, you said.
Not really, no. Little domestic improvement. But internationally, things were shifting. Britain's whole attitude toward its colonies and independence was slowly evolving.
But Lesotho is seen as a colonial problem. Why?
Because of its unique situation, completely surrounded by South Africa, it wasn't straightforward. Britain wasn't quite sure what to do with it.
Did other African nations weigh in? Was there support for Lesotho's independence?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Okay.
There was this important conference in Cairo in 1964.
Okay.
And African leaders there, including ones specifically worried about Lesotho, they openly condemned British colonialism. They were particularly anxious about Britain meddling in Lesotho's knife-edge politics, as one source puts it.
Knife-edge politics, that gives you a sense.
It certainly ruffled feathers back in London. It really showed Lesotho was in this unique, tricky spot.
So fast forward a bit. October 4th, 1966. Independence finally arrives. Joshiso Maletsane is prime minister. King Moshushu II is head of state. Must have been a moment of huge hope. Did stability follow?
Sadly, no. The stability was incredibly brief. Almost immediately, Prime Minister Lebuwa Jonathan declared a state of emergency.
Really? Why?
He outlawed most political opposition and basically ushered in 25 years of authoritarian rule.
35 years. Wow.
Yeah. There's a violent uprising in 1970, and then later in 1986, the military took over under Major General Justin Lekanya.
So not exactly a smooth transition. What about the 1990s then? Did things calm down with the move towards democracy?
Well, the sources say the return to multi-party democracy actually brought major upheavals.
Yeah.
So, no, not calm.
Well, upheavals like what?
To get parliamentary rule back in 93.
Yeah.
Then the Basutoland African National Congress wins by a landslide.
Yeah.
But the political unrest just bubbles away. There's an agreement signed with South Africa in late 97 trying to ensure peace. But by May 98, there's actual fighting, a battle that leads to the takeover of Maseru, the capital.
Good grief. So they needed intervention.
Yes, peacekeeping intervention was required. And that decade also saw serious civil disturbances back in 94, and then more tensions bubbling up again around 2007, 2008. It was just chaotic, repeatedly needing South African help to stop it tipping into a full-blown civil war.
It really sounds like independence didn't sever the ties or the influence from South Africa, just maybe changed its nature.
Precisely.
So let's talk about daily life then. What does all this history mean for the socioeconomic situation in Lesotho today?
Well, economically, Lesotho is just incredibly intertwined with South Africa. It's part of SCCU, that's a Southern African Customs Union.
Right, they share customs revenue and trade policy.
Exactly. And it's also in the common monetary area, which means its currency, the lote, is pegged one-to-one with the South African rand.
So basically, South Africa holds most of the cards economically.
Pretty much, yeah. Both those organizations are heavily influenced, you could say, controlled by South Africa. It creates this huge economic reliance.
And I imagine that 1998 crisis you mentioned, the fighting in Maseru, must have just wiped out any economic progress they'd made in the mid-90s.
Absolutely. It devastated commercial infrastructure, shattered investor confidence. It just reinforces what the sources call Lesotho's colossal dependence on South Africa.
Colossal dependence for everything.
For jobs, for education opportunities, for basic goods. And this has created what one source calls a reflex dependence. People just automatically look to South Africa.
Yeah.
And remittances, that money sent home, which was so vital, that's been dropping sharply.
And the poverty figures are just staggering. Sources say nearly half of all households are below the national poverty line. Unemployment at 45%.
It's incredibly tough. And remember that famine declared in 2002-2003. Crop losses hit 90% in some places. Widespread food shortages affecting a massive chunk of the population.
Just layer upon layer of challenges.
And then, on top of all that, you have the HIV/AIDS crisis.
Yeah, let's talk about that. The third highest infection rate in the world. 1 in 4 adults HIV positive. How does a country even cope with that?
It's multifaceted and just incredibly pressing. It leads to, tragically high death rates, huge numbers of orphans, and a critical shortage of healthcare workers because they're affected too, or they leave.
So who picks up the slack? Who provides the care?
Increasingly, it falls to NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and crucially, kin networks. Family, extended family, neighbors, they're absolutely vital.
It's hard to even comprehend the scale of that. 1 in 4 adults. How does a culture or society adapt to that kind of constant pressure, that grief? What do the sources say about how it's dealt with culturally?
Well, it's interesting. One source points out that the pandemic kind of mirrored or tapped into a pre-existing secretive distrust of morality-attached sexuality within the culture. Meaning talking openly about sex and disease was difficult, which obviously hampered early public health efforts.
Right. Stigma and silence. A familiar challenge.
Exactly. But despite all these immense struggles, Basotho culture itself is incredibly rich and resilient. You see it in the language, Sesotho, which had this 1,000-year oral tradition before it was written down relatively recently.
1,000 years oral. Wow.
Yeah. And in their vibrant festivals, their food, music, sports, the handicrafts are apparently amazing.
So after independence, there must have been this surge of national pride, right? Trying to assert a unique Basotho identity.
Definitely. Attempts to assert Basotho-like uniqueness. But that tension, we keep coming back to tradition versus modernity. That's right there, too.
How does that play out?
Well, sources talk about things like the invention of tradition, maybe academics trying to codify or define what Basotho culture is. There are challenges around ethnic exclusivity. It's this ongoing struggle to figure out how the old ways fit with the new realities.
Let's shift to some other modern dynamics. What about the role of women? Sources say they play a major role behind the scenes, especially in rural areas.
They often carry the main load for the household, childcare, livestock, and increasingly caring for people sick with HIV/AIDS.
But less visible in public life.
Yeah, gender inequality is definitely still an issue, especially in more public or formal roles. Like women might work as paralegals, but rarely actually assist in courtrooms.
Okay.
And there are constitutional and cultural hurdles that make it tough for women to get into political office. There's this telling anecdote from 1997.
Oh, yeah?
Women who were civil servants actually struggled just to get into the Maseru Convention Center for some event. The source notes they had no major role in the center nights. It really highlights their exclusion from certain spaces.
That's quite an image. But you mentioned paralegals. Is there some progress? Are women finding ways to sort of navigate the system?
Yes. There is a positive side.
Yeah.
Women are increasingly learning about the law, often helped by that paralegal sector.
Yeah.
It's giving them better access to justice, a way to understand and assert their rights. It's maybe quiet, but it's significant empowerment.
Okay, that's hopeful. What about education? It's a right in the Constitution, you said.
It is, yes, enshrined as a right. But the reality is constrained by shortages, teachers, resources plus costs, and cultural factors, too.
And its history is complicated, too, right? From mission schools to state control.
Very. And one source makes this really pointed comment that educational liberation was lost when the government basically admitted free education was unaffordable, leading to, in this source's view, neocolonial subjects.
Neocolonial subjects. That's a really strong term. It suggests education isn't necessarily leading to true independence of thought or opportunity.
Exactly. It implies a system still shaped by external forces or limitations, not fully serving Basotho needs.
And technology, another double-edged sword, it seems.
Very much so. Resourceful and restrictive, as one source puts it.
Mhm.
Think about the railway built during colonial times, hailed as progress.
Yeah.
But it ended up being pretty much exclusively for colonialists and officials, not the average Moshoeshoe.
Okay, so not connecting people as intended.
Right. Or even transistor radios. You'd think, great, access to information. But they were apparently used at times to spread slanderous allegations against the king.
Oh, wow. For political ends.
Yeah, contributing, according to this source, to the destruction of the fading Basotho ethnicity, using modern tech to undermine traditional structures or identity.
It's fascinating how things we usually see as purely positive education, technology can have such complex and sometimes negative impacts in a specific context like Lesotho's.
Absolutely. The insight is that for a nation trying to find its feet, navigating this fragile independence, these tools, if they aren't managed really carefully, can actually worsen the very problems they're supposed to solve, like challenges to identity or social cohesion.
It's a real lesson in unintended consequences.
Definitely.
So bringing it all together, looking ahead, what's the outlook? The political future sounds pretty uncertain. Condemnation of electoral problems, security force issues.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit concerning. The sources basically lay out two main paths forward. Path 1. The government manages to keep a lid on opposition, maintains repressive laws, maybe deepens hostility, but keeps control.
Okay, continued repression.
Path 2. The government loses control to some significant extent, maybe instability, fragmentation.
Neither sounds great.
No. And both scenarios, frankly, have serious implications way beyond Lesotho's borders for the whole southern African region.
Which brings us back to that international involvement. It's striking how much external engagement there is, despite the internal issues in the shadow of South Africa.
It is unusual, yeah. Some of it, historically, was unwelcome, like South Africa during apartheid trying to dominate.
Right.
But a lot of it, like the U.S. Peace Corps being there consistently since 1966, various American volunteer agencies, that's been graciously welcomed, often actively sought out by Lesotho itself.
Why do you think that is?
I think it reflects a kind of pragmatism on Lesotho's part, a realistic understanding of its own limited capacity to meet all the needs of its people. They're resilient and willing to build partnerships where they can find them.
So that brings us pretty much to the end of our journey today. We've really covered a lot of ground, haven't we? From those ancient sand paintings, the incredible leadership of Moshushu I, uniting a nation, then through colonial rule, that really difficult path to independence and all the ongoing struggles, poverty, the health crisis, political instability.
While somehow still holding on to this incredibly rich cultural heritage through it all.
Yeah. It's quite a story.
It really is. And that conclusion from one of the sources just sums it up so well, I think.
Read it again.
Yeah. Lesotho, while calling itself a kingdom, has slid gracefully yet suspiciously into the ranks of independent states. It complains that it is not a republic, yet it has seized upon its independence. What shall be the end thereof, nobody can tell. With a noble history of many names and a glorious ancestry of chiefs above named, it will pass on, yet a mystery.
Yet a mystery. That leaves us with a lot to think about, doesn't it? What does it really mean for any nation, but especially one like Lesotho, to be truly independent when its fate seems so tied to its geography, its powerful neighbors, and in many ways still feels like, well, a mystery unfolding?
A question with no easy answer.
Definitely something for you, the listener, to ponder. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.